All right. Hello there, everybody. It's always a little bit of a decision between if you want to go towards the start or towards the end of a conference. Personally, I feel like going towards the end, you have such a standard to live up to. We've had so many amazing talks today with so many talented people. So it's definitely amazing to be here. And I didn't have much of a choice to go towards the end. My flight got delayed until just a couple of hours ago. So glad I was able to make it here in the end. So today we're going to be looking at some threat modeling considerations for medical devices and physical devices. Threat modeling is often a little bit overlooked as a very important part of security, and it's especially overlooked with IoT security, which isn't necessarily as developed. This is not switching the slides. No, it's not working. All right, there we go. Perfect. All right. Now, a little bit of background on where I come from. I work for Blue Goat Cyber. We're a startup based out of Phoenix, Arizona, and we do full service medical device submission and management. And this is mostly targeted against the USA, but we do lots of submissions in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East as well. This is the full cybersecurity package for medical devices. We also work in some other industries with robotics, automotives, cloud testing, and just general penetration testing as well. A little bit of background about myself. So I've joined Blue Goat in 2022. I serve as their director of medical device cybersecurity. I come from a penetration testing and security research background. Used to do a lot of bug bounty hunting and mostly web application hacking back before I switched to medical devices and IoT. Part of what I love so much about medical device testing is you're able to interact with unique devices. And I've been fortunate enough to discover quite a few zero-day vulnerabilities in a lot of medical devices, healthcare technologies that are out in use now. So, as part of working with medical devices, a lot of what I do involves regulatory affairs above cybersecurity on anything else. There is a pretty big blend there, and that's part of what we'll get into during this discussion is how those can kind of meet together. All right, so with medical devices, it can be a little bit ambiguous what a medical device is. Technically, a Band-Aid could be a medical device. So when we're looking at what we're thinking about for a cyber device, as it's typically put, we're going to look at something like an infusion pump, an ECG, glucose monitors, anything really with firmware, software, a computer involved. If you can hack into it, it should be considered a cyber device. There can be a lot of devices that you might not consider as a cyber device, such as an oxygen pump would be a pretty common example. And then a lot of pretty scary ones as well that can cause a lot of damage, like a pacemaker or a surgical robot. Now, why is threat modeling so important for medical devices? There are just constant attacks under healthcare infrastructure. 89% of healthcare facilities experiencing cybersecurity attack every week. The FBI estimates that 53% of medical devices had a known critical vulnerability in 2022, which is pretty scary when you're trusting these devices with your life. So threat modeling is now enforced by most countries for medical devices to try to push this security forward, make sure that vulnerabilities don't make their way into a device. Now, some examples of some pretty nasty vulnerabilities that have popped up in medical devices. Big one that a lot of people know about is the Medtronic insulin pump recall. It was possible for an attacker to remotely change the insulin delivery rate, which could potentially kill a patient. St. Jude also had pacemakers where attackers could interfere with the battery, deplete it, change the pacing modification, which can potentially lead to cardiac arrest. Now, this is an attack that anyone involved with security research is going to be familiar with, the WannaCry ransomware attack. This attack crippled healthcare infrastructure across the world. It was attacking X-ray machines, MRI machines, and then connected critical life support machines as well. Now, why is threat modeling in general important? A lot of security researchers think of threat modeling as a necessary evil, or sometimes a step that you can skip. And I'm here to say it's not something you can skip. Threat modeling is understanding the hypotheticals. Before you get into the nitty-gritty and the fun part of doing the actual hacking, you have to figure out what can you do, where can you go from here. So when you're trying to look at a device or an application, whatever it may be, stopping and stepping back before you're interacting with it, really trying to walk through what are the different things that can happen. That's a great first step to start building security into a device. It's also important to consider it early and often. Way too many times, organizations will do threat modeling right at the end, try to get it out of the way, and then they won't build it into security by design. Security by design is trying to look at a device, look at a product, and say, how can I start with security instead of trying to finish with security? Retrofitting security almost never works. Now, with a medical device and threat modeling in general, there are 4 big questions. And we're going to talk about what those questions look like and some of the important details. The first is, what are we working on? We need to understand it so that we can understand the attacks. Next, what can we go wrong? Or what can go wrong? That one's pretty self-explanatory. What are the possible attacks? What are we going to do about it? How can we prevent them? And did we do a good job? Review processes, review cycles are critical. All right, so what are we working on? This is a deceptively complex question. We need to know what a device does. We need to know what the physical, logical, software components, intended environment, intended use cases, and potential misuse cases. Especially with a medical device, it's pretty common for it to be used under contexts that it may not necessarily be intended for. If you've ever received a medical device for one reason or another, or even if you've received a prescription for a drug of some sort, you'll see a whole list of every single use case, which you shouldn't use it, and when you should use it, the intended environment, and very oftentimes it slips away from that. Now, this is something important to keep in mind. Human error is a huge possibility. So that is a very, very important consideration when looking at what the device does. What shouldn't it do? What environments is it going to be in? All of this stuff goes into play when you're trying to understand it. Now, the next thing that we need to do is visualize it. If you can understand it in your head, that's great, but being able to put it in a way that anyone else can understand is important. That's why we want to look at a standardized approach. For that, we use the DFD3 specification. This is industry standard. It can cover just about anything. If you're working on automotives, robotics, a just logical network, you can use this standard and it's going to apply. It is specially called out for medical devices, and many regulations or regulatory bodies such as the FDA require you to. This is something easy. It lets someone just take a look, immediately know what each process is without needing to get into too much more detail or have a specialized dedicated legend for every single threat model they encounter. Now, when we're looking at a threat modeling diagram, it's going to be a little bit more simple than a traditional architecture diagram. We don't necessarily need to cover every single little bit of information. You don't necessarily need to see the power connections to a light or something like that, unless you want to get really into the detail and you find a way to hack into a light, in which case I commend you. What we want to really look at are just the main key components. What is happening, what are some data flows, and how can we enter this trust boundary? Now, the trust boundary is going to be this square right here. This is anything that we know is okay. Anything else we are not going to consider okay. So it's really important to figure out how stuff can come in and out of the trust boundary. We have entry points right here or somewhere where it blends, something coming out of the trust boundary, something entering the trust boundary. We need to understand what is going on there and pay special attention to it. Now, that does not mean that we can just ignore security for everything on the inside, but it's going to be a little bit less accessible than stuff on the outside and flows in and out of the device. Now, once we understand a device, we know what it is, we know what it's supposed to do, we have to think about what can go wrong. This is a little bit harder than it may seem, just because there are so many things that can go wrong with a device. You can sit down and write thousands and thousands of potential threats and still only be halfway through it. So trying to figure out what common threat categories are is a great way to shave down this process a little bit. To figure out how we're getting there, we still want to know, go back to some of our questions from what are we working on? Where are we supposed to use it? Where aren't we supposed to use it? A lot of devices might only be indicated for use in a hospital, and that means you probably shouldn't use it in your house or the other way around. Typically, we say that anything inside of a hospital can and will get hacked into. Hospitals are absolutely terrifying as far as security. I have more horror stories than I can count about penetration tests against hospitals and seeing absolutely terrible things. So thinking about what is that environment? Who is going to be interacting with it? We'll go back to one of those earlier points. 89% of healthcare facilities are hit by a cyber attack every single week. So we can assume if there's a device in this healthcare facility, it's going to be attacked. Now, one of the ways for trying to break this down into a way and categorize stuff is by threat modeling frameworks. There are tons of different options. I'm sure a lot of you guys with bug bounty experience will be familiar with the OAuth top 10. Some other threat modeling frameworks will be Stride, Pasta, Dread, MITRE ATT&CK. Each one of them has its own use case, advantages, and disadvantages. Now, it would take up a lot of time to go over each one of them, so for the purpose of this, we're just going to be looking at Stride. But it's important to understand that there is no one-size-fits-all situation. There's a reason that the OWASP top 10 is super common for bug bounty platforms and for web applications. It is an easy way to group together web app findings on what is most commonly seen in the wild. Now, with looking at Stride, Pasta, Dread, ATT&CK, each one of them is a little bit different. Stride is trying to categorize things into essentially what the impact is instead of the type of vulnerability. ATT&CK is looking at a specific technique for attack as opposed to a vulnerability itself. So each one can get to a different goal, and each one should be used in a different use case, oftentimes combining them for correct solution as well. All right, now we can get into a little bit more information on what Stride is. It is generally we see as one of the better fits for physical devices when we're threat modeling. But like I said, that can vary. Now, Stride stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. Like I said, this is looking at the impact. So once we are able to execute the attack, what is the end result? What is the attacker trying to gain? When we're looking at spoofing, that's going to be attempting to essentially act as someone that you're not. Information disclosure, that's a pretty obvious one. That is usually one of the more common goals when attacking medical devices, especially since so many of them are going to hold personal information that can be used and leveraged in a phishing attack. Now, there are a couple of ways to assign a threat to categories using Stride. The first is mapping a threat to a category. So you take a single threat. We'll say this threat right here is that the database has sensitive information. Someone enters that database, they'll be able to get that information, and they'll be able to leverage that for something malicious. Now, we're going to map that to a category right here. We say that's part of information disclosure. We'll go to another one. Say users can change other users' passwords. There's a bad access control problem, and developers weren't able to catch it. Now, that goes in a couple of categories. That's tampering. You're messing with someone else's information, and repudiation. You are performing a change on them, and you are not able to prove that you did it. You're essentially just saying they did it and they don't have any proof someone else did it. The other way is mapping categories to threats. So this is essentially just two different ways to visualize it. One is listing out all of the threats. The other is listing out categories and assigning them under each one. Typically, I prefer to map the threats to the categories. That way you don't have a situation where there's overlap on multiple areas here, but everyone can go about it in a different way. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, when we're considering spoofing, what is every way that someone can do this? Or if we're looking at information disclosure, how many different ways are there to disclose information? And then we're going to try and list them all down here. Now there can be overlap. When we're trying to think of tampering, we say, oh, well, this can also apply under repudiation. So there's no one right